In this video, we'll be considering the use of risk maps in enterprise risk management. Risk maps are pretty much the same as the risk matrix, which you studied in an earlier course. They may be the most commonly used enterprise risk management risk profile tool. They've also been widely criticized, perhaps most thoroughly in Douglas Hubbard's book, The Failure of Risk Management. The most common and serious criticism of risk maps is that they're not always based on evidence. Instead, constructing a risk map can be a subjective process, based on consensus or whatever feels right, rather than what truly is. I do not believe the tool itself is flawed, so much as the way the tool is wielded. When based on sound evidence, the tool can have value. When it is not based on evidence, it may have little more value than a horoscope. Hubbard proposes quantitative risk modeling as the solution, but it may be possible to develop meaningful insights into risk without risk modeling, that is quantitative. If you're going to use a table like this, make sure the scoring or scaling is based on sound evidence. The quality of a risk map can often be opaque. Consider the following probability and consequence scales used by the United Kingdom housing authorities. The ranges are quite quantitative, and they provide the illusion of quantitative analysis. If scores are assigned based on opinion rather than evidence, there is little of reliable value in these scores. Seeing the table and the score's scaled definitions tells us nothing about the manner in which the scores were arrived at. Here's a risk matrix done by the University of Washington. It shows likelihood and impact categories that rely on the mathematics of imprecise and possibly meaningless numbers. Elsewhere in this program, you've seen the same mathematics used to illustrate the desire to make the color categories of the map bear some resemblance to quantitative risk assessment results. Notice that the color scheme used here does not conform to the mathematical principles developed by Tony Cox as presented in our first exposure to risk matrices. Why is the 12 amber and not brown? These are judgments that are difficult to justify on the basis of sound argument. Coloring here, as with many risk matrices, is rather arbitrary. I use the examples you see here not to criticize risk maps, but to demonstrate the wide range of application and the continuing evolution and struggle businesses have in choosing a proper one. The arbitrary nature of a risk map is seen in the arbitrary flip-flopping in the 2x2 matrix here. The British Columbia Lottery Commission used the top matrix in 2003. By 2008, the matrix had evolved to the bottom matrix, where inherent and residual risks were scored 1 to 5, and the ratios of these two scores were compared to determine the risks. But I'd also like you to notice how the color scheme changed. The top right corner of the quadrant has consistently shown the highest risk. The second highest risk in 2003 was considered to be the top left. By 2008, it had been reassigned to the bottom right. Compare the color scheme here to the University of Washington matrix. The Utah Workers' Compensation Fund used the definitions shown here. If you find them difficult to interpret and/or to understand, so do I. Despite the lack of standardization in the risk map coloring and the uncertain role that evidence plays in the construction of a risk map, these maps are widely used in enterprise risk management. Just know that if a good process isn't used, the results may be specious at best. There are a great many firms that may be said to be complying with the requirements of ERM, rather than to be using good risk management practices. Now consider the hypothetical map shown here, which does show consistent coloring qualities. An organization would go through each risk in its profile and locate it on the map, as shown here for 5 hypothetical risks. Each number corresponds to a specific hypothetical risk. Risks may be entered asymmetrically in the cell to reflect perceived nuances of differences in the likelihood or consequence. There are more sophisticated uses of risk maps as well. Risk maps are static and are generally unable to convey codependencies among and between risks. Neither do they always convey uncertainty effectively. Additional layers or dimensions of information can be added to the maps, using dot size or color to indicate different attributes of the risks. For example, the larger the dot, the more departments and activities could be affected by the risk. Shown on the top map, Risk 1 is the most codependent risk. Risk 4 is the least codependent. A dynamic map, such as that shown at the bottom of the screen, can track an organization's success in reducing a risk over time. Risk number 4 began in the original position in the upper right, and you can see how attempts to manage the risk eventually moved it to a lower cell. This is an example of a value map. Up until now, the maps we've considered have shown losses only. A value map shows losses and opportunities. There can be risks of loss, seen to the left of the value map, and risks of potential gain, seen to the right of the value map. Detailed labels for the rows and the columns have been omitted here, but they can be easily imagined. Take a look at the value map in the lower right. It shows the evolution of a risk. Risk 1 begins as a low probability risk and evolves into a high probability risk, while Risk 2 begins as a positive outcome and evolves into a negative outcome. Dynamic uses of a risk map like this may add value to their storytelling ability. The map in the upper left shows the juxtaposition of two current risks. Let's look at a few more examples. Notice in the California Public Employees Retirement example, colors exist on a gradient. This supports a more granular refinement of the risk scores, but it is difficult, if not impossible, to support this level of detail with qualitative data. This example represents a true heat map. Also, note that the line represents a boundary between acceptable and unacceptable risks. This could reflect the company's risk tolerances or its risk appetite. Outsourcing Risk provides another example. Notice that they use ISO lines to divide the map into areas of very high risk, medium risk, moderate risk, and in the lower left-hand corner, acceptable risk. Notice the legend in the lower right-hand side that defines the 5-point scale used to define the horizontal and vertical axes. It lends itself to a somewhat more quantitative version of this qualitative risk assessment tool. Chartered Global Management Accountant offers a pretty standard heat map example. Notice the scales described at the left and the risk legend at the bottom left. This is an example that shows risks identified and plotted on the map. Deloitte and Touche offer this example of a map that shows the interaction among the various risks profiled. Notice, for example, the economic downturn is closely related to almost all other risks. This and the following slide illustrates some creative uses of the idea of a risk map. Here's another Deloitte and Touche map that's rather unique. It shows actors and impacts rather than consequences and their probabilities. There is no spatial dimension to the risks in this matrix. Each cell is colored separately. Consider the risk of financial theft and fraud. Organized criminals, insiders and partners, and skilled individual hackers represent high risks. Competitors are considered low risk. And hacktivists and nation states are not considered a risk at all. A well-designed heat map will help an audience understand the multiple variables that can combine to threaten a company. ERM teams that want to make their heat map as good as it can be should consider the 6 tips I'm going to discuss with you now. First, separate the impact ratings for different kinds of risks. For example, financial, operational, and strategic risks. They can be shown on a different map. Second, add layers to traditional impact and likelihood displays. Display different dimensions like correlation and risk management control effectiveness. Third, demonstrate the effectiveness of risk management plans by including inherent and residual risks. Illustrate reductions in risk exposure by mitigations or internal controls. This map shows the inherent risk at point IR. Risk management option A reduces the risk to point RR. This is the residual risk. Then option B takes it down to the target risk, point TR. Fourth, differentiate zones of acceptable and unacceptable risk exposure. Red areas on the heat map are unacceptable, blue is acceptable. A line could be drawn to illustrate the boundary between acceptable and unacceptable risk, or to display the company's level of risk tolerance. Fifth, display changes over time by demonstrating movements in risk exposure values, shown here by the arrows. 6. Establish risk reduction targets by inserting desired risk levels that can instigate conversations about specific mitigation activities. This was done here with point TR. It sounds complicated, but it doesn't have to be. While all these factors may sound like they make something that should be simple overly complex, that's not necessarily the case if it's done correctly. This PEPCO map shows the trajectory of a risk. It shows the inherent and residual risk levels as well as the target risk level. And the mitigation plan is revealed by the risk management options A and B. The probability and impact score is available for the inherent, residual, and target risk, and the entire diagram is relatively easy to read. Heat maps are a way of presenting a qualitative and quantitative evaluation of the probability of risk occurrence and its impact on the organization in the event that a particular risk is experienced. The development of an effective heat map has several critical elements: an understanding of the risk appetite of the company, a common language for assigning probabilities and potential impacts. 5x5 heat map diagram seen here provides an illustration of how corporations can map probability ranges to common qualitative characterizations of a likelihood, and a ranking scheme for potential impacts. They can also rank impacts on the basis of what is material, financial terms, or in relation to achievement of strategic objectives. In this example, risks are prioritized using a simple example of a multiplication. The row value is multiplied by the column value, and I would remind you this technique has been widely criticized. So what benefits do risk maps provide? They provide a visual, holistic, big picture view to share while making strategic decisions. They provide improved management of risks and governance of the risk management process, increased focus on the risk appetite and risk tolerance of the company, more precision in the risk assessment process, identification of gaps in the risk management and control process, and greater integration of risk management across the enterprise.